Shalom Israel. Before I start, I want to give all praises to Yahweh, Ba'ashem Yahushai, Yahweh Kakadash, double honors to the elders and apostles in Israel who will and teach well, Akims and the Iris and Byras and those pushing videos in truth and sincerity, to the brothers and sisters in the truth. Now I came across this video here, and it's called What Happened to the Edomites? Yeah, and this is by David Gusick. Now this guy here, he funds or sponsors, I should say. Oh, where's that one? See up there. I had it on one of these. Give me a second. Let's see if I can find it. Oh, it's gone. But I told you that he sponsors the Blue Letter Bible. He's one of the sponsors. Oh, it's gone. Okay. Well, it just showed not too long ago that he was a sponsor for the Blue Letter Bible. It's gone. Can't find it. But either way, it makes no difference to what I'm going to go through. So, someone must have thrown in a question, what happened to the Edomites? So, this is Edom answering the question as to what happened to the Edomites. And when you listen to what he says, you know, you see that he totally contradicts himself. He gives an explanation where he goes through Isaiah 6-3, and he reads Isaiah 6-3 verses 1-4, and then he gives an explanation as to what happened to the Edomites. But you see that he contradicts himself in what he says. So I just want to play some of this video here and just correct what he's actually saying.
Beginning in the first 4 verses. Now, I'm only going to read to you here the Isaiah chapter 63 passage, because actually the Isaiah chapter 34 passage is very similar. They essentially say the same thing. So Isaiah chapter 63, let me start reading to you now from verse 1. Who is this who comes from Edom with dyed garments from Bozrah? Bozrah was at one time the capital city of Edom and the Edomites. So who is this who comes from Edom with dyed garments from Bozrah, the one who is glorious in his apparel, traveling in the strength, in the greatness of his strength? I who speak in righteousness, mighty to save. Why is your apparel red and your garments like one who treads the winepress? By the way, Bozrah, the name of that city that at one time was the capital city of the Edomites, that name means winepress. Continuing on, verse 3. I have trodden the winepress alone, and from the peoples no one was with me. I have trodden them in my anger and trampled them in my fury. Their blood is sprinkled upon my garments, and I have strained all my robes. For the day of vengeance is in my heart, and the year of my redeemed has come. That's the end of verse 4. So here what we have is we have a clear, and if you take a look at the broader context, you'll see this is a clear message of the return of Jesus Christ in judgment. We would consider it to apply to the ultimate judgment, when Jesus returns to judge the earth, when Jesus returns at Armageddon, so to speak.
So remember, that's what he says. It'll apply to the ultimate judgment. Yeah. What you just read there in Isaiah 63, when Yahushua returns to judge the earth.
So, what's the connection here with Edom, mentioned in verse 1 of Isaiah chapter 63, and again also mentioned in a very similar context in Isaiah?
And just to add, that is true, that in Isaiah 63 is a future prophecy of when Yahushua returns and is bringing judgment upon Edom.
Chapter 34. So I would disagree that this passage tells us that Jesus will come back to a kingdom ruled by Edom.
And that also is true. The passage does not speak about Yahushua coming back, in a kingdom that was ruled by Edom, but there are scriptures that tells you that the Edomites will be ruling at the end of the world. So even though that passage is not speaking about Yahushua coming back to a kingdom ruled by Edom, we know from scriptures that the Edomites will be ruling when Yahushua returns. This is 2 Ezra 6 and 7. Then answered I and said, what shall be the parting asunder of the times, or when shall be the end of the first and the beginning of it that followeth? So the end of the first is dealing with the kingdom that we're in, and the beginning would be the New Jerusalem, the kingdom of heaven. And he said unto me, from Abraham unto Isaac, when Jacob and Esau were born of him, Jacob's hand held first the heel of Esau, for Esau is the end of the world, and Jacob is the beginning of it that followeth. So the scriptures lets us know that Esau will be in power when Yahushua returns, but Isaiah 63 is not speaking about that. It's speaking about judgment upon Esau. So I think he kind of threw that in. I don't know why he threw that in, but it's like he's trying to explain a way that the Edomites actually, because I've watched up to a certain part. When you think about it, the reason why he has thrown that in, because when he gives an explanation, as we're going to watch later on, as to what has happened to Esau, he can't say this is Yahushua bringing judgment upon Esau and they're ruling at the end of the earth, at the end of time, if Esau is still around. Because his explanation, when we see it, Esau is not around.
That this passage tells us that Jesus will come back to a kingdom ruled by Edom.
So like I said, that passage is not speaking about a kingdom being ruled by Edom. It's speaking about judgment upon Edom. But he mentioned that to try and justify what his explanation when we watch it later on in this.
First of all, Isaiah chapter 63 verse 1 says that he's coming from Edom. Now, it's true that Edom is mentioned in both Isaiah chapter 63 and in Isaiah chapter 34 in connection to God's ultimate judgment. But this is for a very important reason, because
remember, he just said that they're in connection with God's ultimate judgment. When would that be? That would be at the end of time when Yahushua returns to bring judgment upon the earth. Yeah, just remember these things that he's saying.
Edomites were prominent among the nations around Israel that hated Israel. Now, it's fascinating, at least to me, the hatred that the Edomites had for Israel was kind of ironic, because they were descended from Esau, the brother of Jacob, whose name was later changed to Israel and was the patriarch of the 12 tribes of Israel. The Edomites, descended from Esau, settled on the eastern side of the Jordan River, essentially on the eastern side of the Dead Sea. Now, in his comments on Isaiah, Bultima gives a good sense of this. He says this, quote, Edom was a sister nation to Israel, but it hated Israel more than any other nation. Throughout all of history,
which is true, because the scripture lets you know that Esau had a perpetual hatred. You don't read about that concerning the other nations. This is, the scriptures lets you know that these nations have conspired against us, but Esau, it lets you know they've had a perpetual hatred. This is Amos 1 and 11. Says, thus saith the Lord, for 3 transgression of Edom, and for 4 I will not turn away the punishment thereof, because he did pursue his brother with the sword, and did cast off all pity, and his anger did tear perpetually, and he kept his wrath forever. It says his anger did tear perpetually. What is that word? Perpetually.
Strong's H 5703. Add.
Says perpetuity, forever, continuing future, creation of past time, forever, of future time, of continuous existence, forever. So that hatred that Esau has for us is continual. You don't read of such hatred amongst the other nations, even though you do read that they do hate us. It tells that Esau's hatred is perpetual, continual, forever.
We see a burning hatred of Edom against Israel. It is for this reason that Edom is frequently presented as a representation of all the nations that hated the Jews.
And I'd have to disagree with that. Esau hated, Edomites have their hatred for Israel. These other nations have their hatred for Israel. The difference is Israel's hatred is a perpetual, a continual hatred, as the scriptures teach.
Did you get that, what he says? And I would agree with Bultima in his commentary on Isaiah regarding that. He says that Edom is frequently presented as a representation of all the nations that hated the Jews. Therefore, we see that both in Isaiah chapter 63 and Isaiah chapter 34, that Edom is a representative of the nations who are against God and his people. Isaiah is connecting the judgment against the Edomites. Again, if you notice, he says here in verse 1 of chapter 63, who comes from Edom. In other words, he has already judged Edom. Now he's going to bring his judgment against the whole earth.
Yeah, so then how are they a representation of the hatred that these other nations have? They have their own hatred for Israel.
So Edom is a representative of these nations, and the judgment against the Edomites, who were known as those who hated God and his people, is here connected with the ultimate judgment that will happen at the return of Jesus Christ.
Remember, so that again 3 times now is mentioning that the judgment here against the Edomites, is dealing with the judgment at that time, the ultimate judgment when Yahushua returns. So that means for Yahushua to be bringing judgment on the Edomites when he returns, that means the Edomites must still be around. Yeah, remember that.
So that's my understanding, and certainly I'm not alone in that understanding. It's a very common interpretation and understanding of these references to Edom in Isaiah chapter 34 and 63.
Well, let's just quickly go right there, because the reason why it's coming from Edom, this is Isaiah 63 and 1, says, who is that cometh from Edom with dyed garments from Bozrah? And it's dealing with the people, yeah? This that is glorious in his apparel, traveling in the greatness of his strength. I that speak in righteousness, mighty to save. Wherefore art thou red in thine apparel, and thy garments like him that treadeth the wine fat? So it's saying, like, why is your garments all red? It's going to explain to you why his garments are all red. I have trodden the winepress alone, and of the people there was none with me, for I would tread them in mine anger. Now who's to them? Edom. Yeah, he's going to tread them in his anger, and trample them, Edom, in my fury, and their blood shall be sprinkled upon my garments, and I will stain all my raiment. So this is why it's coming from Edom. This is why he's visited them, to bring judgment upon them. So when he says, this is the future judgment upon Edom when Yahushua returns, that is true. Yeah, so that means for Yahushua to bring judgment upon Edom when he returns, they must be here. So let's see how he continues to explain what happens to the Edomites.
But that really doesn't answer the question. What happened to the Edomites? Well, let me tell you just straightforwardly, the Edomites were judged by God such as the prophets said would happen. Prophets such as Obadiah, prophets such as Jeremiah. The prophets said that the Edomites would be judged by God, and they were. And this happened in a few different phases or periods. First, the Edomites.
Now you hear that? He said they're going to be judged by God, yeah, and they were. But we just read that Yahushua is going to be bringing judgment upon the Edomites. So when has that happened?
Edomites were conquered by the Nabatean Arabs, perhaps as early as 500 BC. Nelson Glueck, in his book, The Other Side of the Jordan, explains that not all the Edomites left the region of Edom when the Nabatean Arabs took control of the area. Those who did leave the land of Edom, they went to the area of southern Judah, that is the land on the western side of the Dead Sea. If you've ever been to Masada and the whole area surrounding that, that became the place where many of the refugees from Edom went when they were pushed out of their own lands by the Nabatean Arabs who invaded them. Now, this area of southern Judah, it's a very wild wilderness area. Again, if you've ever been to Masada, you know what kind of geography we're talking about. These people became known as Idumeans, and the area became known as Idumea. Now, they also, when they came in, they mixed with people already living in that area, though there weren't a lot, there certainly were people there. When the Idumeans continued conflict with the Jewish people in the time of the Maccabees, the Jewish people conquered them, and they assimilated them by force. F.F. Bruce writes in his book, Israel and the Nations. F.F. Bruce is a guy I really appreciate both as a historian and as a Bible commentator.
You notice, right, there's, apart from reading Isaiah 63, that's the long and short of all the scriptures that's brought out.
F.F. Bruce writes about how there was conflict and war between the Jewish people and the Idumeans in the time of the Maccabees. That's the period between the end of the Old Testament history and the start of the New Testament. Again, Bruce, regarding the Jewish leader John Hyrcanus, says that around 100 years before the birth of Jesus, I'm going to quote to you now from page 171 of F.F. Bruce's book, Israel and the Nations. He says this: to the south, Hyrcanus warred against the Idumeans, who had been such a thorn in the side of the Judeans since the dark days at the end of the southern monarchy. He subjugated them, that is the Idumeans, and compelled them to accept circumcision and thus be formally incorporated as members of the Jewish nation. So the Idumeans that survived, that moved over to the west part of the Jordan River, the west side of the Dead Sea, they assimilated into the Jewish population at least 100 years before the time of Jesus.
And he's letting you know that Idumeans, yeah, who he's referring to as Idumeans, are Edomites.
Now, if you fast forward about 160 years, by the end of the spring in AD 68, the Romans, when they conquered the area of Judah and Moab and all the rest of it, they completely laid waste to Idumea. So this was effectively the end of the Edomite people, who had long been in decline and had long been mixing with the neighboring peoples, again, for a long time.
So you hear that now? So the Romans now come and they put an end to the Edomites. But earlier on, he was saying that Yahushua was going to be returning and bringing judgment upon the Idumeans. You know, you can't really trust Esau to give you the truth of the matter. You know, just in the first 13 minutes, he's contradicted himself, and this is an hour-long video. With these other nations, this is Obadiah, chapter 1 and 15. It says, "For the day of the Lord is near upon all the heathen." The word "heathen" is just dealing with nations. Yeah, letting you know that all these nations are going to get their own separate judgment. Yeah, it's not Idumea or Edomites being judged on behalf of the these other nations. Yeah, it says, "As thou hast done, shall be done unto thee; thy reward shall return upon thine own head. For as ye have drunk upon my holy mountain, so shall all the heathen drink continually. Yea, they shall drink, and they shall swallow down, and they shall be as though they had not been. But upon Mount Zion shall be deliverance, and there shall be holiness, and the house of Jacob shall possess their possessions." Letting you know that salvation is only for Israel. "And the house of Jacob shall be a fire, and the house of Joseph a flame." Yeah, referring to the 12 tribes. "And the house of Esau for stubble, and they shall kindle in them and devour them, and there shall not be any remaining of the house of Esau, for the Lord has spoken it." Now, going by what he's saying, it was the Romans that put an end to the Edomites. But here we're seeing that the Israelites are going to have a hand in bringing judgment upon the Edomites. And when we go back to Isaiah 63, yeah, Yahushua himself is going to be visiting Edom to bring judgment upon them. So that totally disregards what he's trying to say. You know, he totally contradicted himself. First, he started off saying Isaiah 63 was dealing with, let me see if I can quickly find that, judgment.
So I would disagree that this passage tells us that Jesus will come back to a kingdom ruled by Edom. First of all, Isaiah chapter 63 verse 1 says that he's coming from Edom. Now, it's true that Edom is mentioned in both Isaiah chapter 63 and in Isaiah chapter 34 in connection to God's ultimate judgment.
Yeah, it says they're mentioned in connection with God's ultimate judgment. So if that's the ultimate judgment, which is going to be at the end of the world, so to speak, when Yahushua returns, yeah, to judge these nations, how is he then saying later on that they were done away with by the Romans? Now, in visiting, Yahushua visiting Edom was to bring judgment upon Edom. Yeah, this is Isaiah 34 and 1. It says, "Come near, ye nations, to hear and hearken, ye people. Let the earth hear, and all that is therein, the world and all things that come forth of it. For the indignation of the Lord is upon all nations." That goes back to what we read in Isaiah, Obadiah. You know, "For the day of the Lord is near upon all heathen." That word heathen is the same as nations. It's the same word. So it's basically saying the same thing.
Strong's H 1471. Goy. Goy.
It says nation people, usually of non-Hebrew people, and that term came along later on. You know, when you read Genesis 10, it refers to, uses the term nation back then. Quickly see if I can get that. Genesis 10. Genesis 10. Yeah, it says Genesis 10 and 5. "By these were the isles of the Gentiles, divided in their lands, everyone after his tongue and after their families in their nation." So Gentile, heathen, these are all dealing with the same thing, nation. When you look here, Gentiles, H1 471. You come down, nations, H1 471. So just use two different terms to refer to the same thing. Yeah, when you look, Goy,
Strong's H 1471. Goy. Goy.
yeah, saying the same thing. So we'll come back to Isaiah 34 and 2. It says, "For the indignation of the Lord is upon all nations, all the heathen, and his fury upon all their armies. He has utterly destroyed them. He has divided them to the slaughter," because there's judgment coming not just for Esau, but also for these other nations. So their slain also shall be cast out. Slakia. And their stink shall come up out of their carcasses, and the mountains shall be melted with their blood. And the Lord of heaven, Slakia, and all the host of heaven shall be dissolved, and the heavens shall be rolled together as a scroll, and all their hosts shall fall down as the leaf falleth off from the vine, and as a fallen fig from the fig tree. There's the point. My sword shall be bathed in heaven. Behold, it shall come down upon Idumea. Yeah, this is why Yahushua was visiting Edom, because of the judgment that he's going to bring. It says Isaiah 34 and 5, "For my sword shall be bathed in heaven. Behold, it shall come down upon Idumea, upon the people of my curse to judgment. The sword of the Lord is filled with blood, is made fat with fatness, and with the blood of lambs and goats, with the fat of kidneys of rams. For the Lord as a sacrifice in Bozrah, and a great slaughter in the land of Idumea." So this is why Yahushua is coming from Bozrah, from Edom, and his garments are all red, because he's gone there to bring judgment. Yeah. So for Yahushua to be bringing judgment upon Edom, they have to be around to bring judgment. So him saying that the Romans now are the ones that did away with the Edomites, that's totally incorrect and a contradiction to what he's saying. Let me see if I can find that bit again.
When the Nabatean Arabs took control of the area, those who did leave the area became known as Edomia. Now, they also, when they came in,
Yeah.
John Hyrcanus says that around 100 years before the birth of Jesus, I'm going to quote to you now from page 171 of F.F. Bruce's book, Israel and the Nations. He says this: "To the south, Hyrcanus warred against the Edomians, who had been such a thorn in the side of the Judeans."
Just want to get that bit.
68. The Romans, when they conquered the area of Judah and Moab and all the rest of it, they completely laid waste to Edomia.
So that's incorrect. No, they didn't completely lay waste to all the Idumeans, because the Idumeans are still around today. The Romans themselves are living Edomites. This is Ecclesiastes 4 and 15. It says, "I considered all the living which walk under the sun, with the second child that shall stand up in his stead. There is no end of all the people." Yeah. "Even of all that have been before them, they also that come after shall not rejoice in him. Surely this also is vanity and vexation of spirit." So the scripture says there's no end of all the people. So the people that we read about in the scriptures, Moabites, Edomites, Hamites, Ishmaelites, Elamites, yeah, they're still around today, just going by different names. And for these prophecies to fulfill, yeah, Yahushua coming from Edom, yeah, where he's bringing judgment upon Edomites, they have to be around when he returns. So his explanation of the Romans doing away with the Edomites, that's totally incorrect. And I just wanted to go through that video there, or bits of it, just to correct that car. Even when you look in the comments, there's many brothers in there that's showing them that it's totally off. So fake pastor, stop lying. Obadiah is an end time prophecy. Yeah, so it hasn't happened yet. That's true. Yeah, I said no nation is done away with, which already now is Ecclesiastes. Lies, lies, and more lies. Esau is still trying to hide his identity. That's true. And that's what this video is really. Esau's still trying to hide. You know, like I said, he mentioned how Isaiah 63 is speaking about end time judgment when Yahushua returns, but then he explains that away by saying the Romans did away with the Edomites, which is totally incorrect, man. Yeah, they're still around today, people. So with that, I'm going to close out. I'm going to give all praises to Yahweh, Bashem Yahushai, Harakah Kadash, Kwam Nasha Allah.